Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this critical thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright, I got a good critical thought for you today. We're going to be talking about what I feel are the three essential parts of the Dark Souls formula. Over the last few years, with the rise of Soulsborne, we've been seeing a new subgenre being thrown around, the Souls-like. Which, first off, what do you guys think about that term? Do you think that's going to stick? With that said, though, this is one of the instances where a game's popularity or excellence in design has kind of turned it into a subgenre, with of course another big example being Metroidvania with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But when we have something like this with a new subgenre or a new genre of games, of course it means that developers are going to try and emulate it, be it in 2D, 3D, whatever platform you can think of. And the thing about Dark Souls and of course Bloodborne is that they really are a masterclass of design, which means it's very hard to get it right and it's very easy to mess it up. And for today, I want to talk about the three parts that I feel pretty much personify or are the main marketing points of a Dark Souls or Souls-like game. Now, with that said, when I'm thinking of this idea of Souls-like, it reminds me a lot of obviously a roguelike. Now, when we think of most roguelikes, they are usually on the RPG or abstracted side of the spectrum. Of course, for longtime fans of the genre, you know, of course, of games like NetHack and the original Rogue. When I think Souls-like, I think about it as a roguelike, but instead of being focused on the RPG, it's coming at it from the action side. And with that said, the first of the three big points should be obvious: the combat. Combat in a Souls game or Bloodborne is one of the most I guess, fine the detailed parts of these designs, and it has to be. Because if your combat system doesn't work, or it's annoying or frustrating to play, that kind of reverberates out to every part of your design. Not just fighting enemies, but exploring levels, corpse runs, and the like. And one of the key parts about a Souls-like combat system, in my opinion, is that both the enemies and the player have to be roughly on the same page. Now, with that said, of course, enemies will usually have unique advantages that the player doesn't. In the Souls series, of course, we run into predominantly range enemies, spellcasters, or even enemies like the skeletons in Dark Souls, who, when you kill them, they just get right back up unless you finish them with a holy or blessed type weapon. Now, when it comes to things from a speed perspective, this is one of the trickier parts. When we look at most action-based titles, your Devil May Cry's, God Hands, God of War, and so on, the player is usually faster than the enemy. This is of course to compensate for the fact that the player will normally be fighting waves or larger groups of enemies. If you were playing Devil May Cry and the enemies were as fast and as reactive as Dante, it would be a completely different experience. In the Souls series, both groups are usually kept within relative speeds of each other. When you play Dark Souls, my character has like the same kind of heft and slowness to his attacks that the enemy does. But when you play Neo, the enemies are almost as reactive and as sped up as the player. Now here's a question for you. Would you consider Neo to be a Souls-like, or would you think of it as more of an action title? I think it honestly skirts the line, or it kind of like steps like right on that line between the two. Now, one of the major problems I've been having, and the reason why I'm making this video is with the Surge, is that combat feels off balance against the player. Enemies do a lot more damage compared to the player. They can actually respond faster than what the player can do. And this is one of the big things that I've noticed. For those of you who have watched my Surge plays, I've pointed this out several times, but traditionally when you play a Souls game, when you hit an enemy or you can stagger them, that basically gives you free reign to attack them with, limitations of your stamina. In the Surge, however, once an enemy has been staggered, the next attack on that enemy will immediately trigger their next attack animation. And you've seen that, I hope, from when I point out during those plays. Now, that is definitely a rule violation in terms of the combat system. It's not something that the player has access to, and it makes fights a lot more mechanical than what they should be. And I know I've used the term mechanical gameplay a lot in these videos and discussions, and we'll be doing a critical thought on that, I think, real soon, just to expand on that term. Now, another part about this is, if the player can block, then the enemy can block. And while I'm playing the Surge, I'm noticing that enemies can block my attacks, but when I try and block them, I'm taking full damage, and sometimes just getting my guy knocked down to the ground to then be finished off. And this is one of the trickier parts about the Souls-like formula, is that both sides have to be balanced, even if it is slightly asymmetrical. In Bloodborne, for instance, you have humanoid enemies who react very similar to the player. But then, of course, you have the monster-sized enemies, usually those that are at least 2.5 or more times the player's height. Now, when I'm fighting something like Amidala, which I know I just completely butchered, and a lot of the larger enemies whose names are escaping me, I'm not going to block those attacks. I'm going to dodge the hell out of the way. But I know when I'm fighting someone who's even in terms of my height, that they start, swinging a scythe or shooting, that I can block that and relatively absorb the damage. Of course, we're talking about Dark Souls. In Bloodborne, it is all about the dodging, which I think I may have just butchered that analogy to some extent, and I'm sorry about that. Now, moving on, the second big part of a Souls-like is the level design. And this could easily be its own topic and then some when it comes to talking about game development. The level design of the Souls series, or Souls-like in general, are a bit higher class compared to traditional games. When we think of normal level design, from anything like Super Mario Brothers to Doom to wow, this is one of those topics where it's overwhelming my brain. I can't think of too many examples. Or even something like The Legend of Zelda in terms of its dungeon layouts. The levels are designed as a linear set of environments or situations. You have the beginning, you have like a challenge, you may have an arena fight, then you have the boss, and then you have the end, and you move on to the next. In a Souls game, or especially in something like Bloodborne and the Dark Souls titles, the levels are built more open-ended than they are in wow, my mouth just completely failed there, in traditional games, by the fact that you have multiple paths to explore. And the key part about a Souls-like is opening up shortcuts, being able to either bypass complete sections or just speed up getting from point A to point B. Now, that has a big part to do with the roguelike elements of a Souls title. And the fact that, of course, if you die, you go back to whatever your checkpoint is, be it the start of the level, a bonfire, and I'm sure we'll come up with more and more examples of that system in the future. And of course, all the enemies will respawn, and you're basically going to have to fight them again. By opening up shortcuts, it not only transforms the level, but it acts as a permanent reward. I know that if I just, bloodied and bruised, crawled my way to the switch and opened up the drawbridge or the door or the castle, whatever, then I know that when I come back to it, I can skip all that and just go straight through that. Anyone who played Demon Souls probably remembers the, I hope I get this right, the Valley of Defilement, or 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it's 5-2, if I'm thinking right in Demon Souls, where the whole level, or the first quarter to half of this level, is just a run through a poison-filled swamp that slows you down. And the key, angel choir moment of that level is getting all the way back to the start and cutting the drawbridge or pulling the switch that drops the drawbridge down, so you can now just walk across that and bypass the entire level. But it's not only, a good Souls-like is not only about having those kinds of shortcuts, but building an environment that is also memorable. This is one of the hardest aspects to do. One of the things that we've seen in a lot of older games is that rooms tend to repeat in terms of their background art or their design. Maybe there's a different platform, maybe there's a new enemy type, but typically the level doesn't change, or because it is a linear set of events, it's just going from A to B. But in a Souls-like, especially with games like what From Software has mastered, they build their environments to almost be lived in, to the sense that if I'm in one room, it's going to look different and there'll be different environmental challenges and enemies compared to this room over here. But they all exist within the same environmental structure or architecture. When you're going through something like the Pain World in Dark Souls, yes, the motif is, castle. But there's different parts of that castle. There are the catacombs with those crazy wheelie skeletons. There's the courtyard with that goo thing that has a lot of spears. There's the broken bridge with the undead skeleton or undead dragon skeleton and so on. But each part is not only memorable, but it allows you to establish a sense of place. I know if I'm let's say on a bridge with fire shooting out, that I'm in this part of a level. If I'm in a section where there's guys with blowguns shooting at me, I'm at that part of the level. It makes it a lot easier to process the level and start to build that mental map. One of the problems I have with the Surge is that basically the entire motif is factory/industrial. So it makes it hard for each area to stand out. You may name these areas differently, but if one room is a gray wall with black borders in it, and then the second room is a gray wall with black borders in it with the exact same background art and objects, then it becomes a lot harder for me to figure out, okay, where the hell am I in this level? Which of course makes it very difficult to do those corpse runs. Speaking of which, that takes me to the final part, and one of the hardest ones to get right, progression. Progression in the Souls, just like the combat system, is a make it or break it element. If your progression system doesn't work, then the player feels like they're just hitting their head against a wall, and they're going to stop. Or you make it too pronounced, and the player just grows to godlike powers, and then the challenge is gone. Now, we've talked about progression in earlier critical thoughts, but the ever-present key point is that the player should always feel like they're making progress. Be it in, a sharp curve forward in terms of upgrades and level ups and equipment, or even just like something very small like this, where they're just killing enemies, getting the scrap or the souls or whatever you want to call it, that they need to eventually upgrade. The idea is that there should always be something that the player can improve on, be it themselves by learning enemy combos or learning to repose or stagger, or from the character point of view by leveling up your soul level, upgrading your gear, finding a new spell, buying a new item, anything like that. As long as there is a carrot on the end of the stick for the player to go after, they'll keep playing. And this is why it's very important to balance combat and balance the progression. Because if you make the idea, or if you have the concept that you die, you lose all your resources, or you die and you have a chance to get them back, the player has to be given a fair shot to do it. With the Surge, I am really not a fan of the fact that there's a time limit and you're fighting enemies who can 2 or 3 shot you at the same time. Because it means that the further you get, the more punishing it's going to be to even have a chance to get your resources back. And remember, you lose those resources, you just wasted the last 5, 10, or even 20 or 30 minutes of play. That's why it has to be balanced and has to be fair to give the player a decent chance at getting to it. The other point is that progression has to be always present. One of the problems with the Surge, and I talked about in my review, is that while I love the idea of you getting new gear via killing enemies and the implants, actual upgrades or changes are very few and far between those levels. If this was more of an ARPG like Neo, or even something like Diablo 3 that had randomly or procedurally generated gear, then progress is a lot more varied. You could kill enemies and it'd be like just getting the same enemy, same gear, and then all of a sudden you get something rare that shoots you up. But the idea, of course, is that you're still making progress. In the Surge, what I find is that my own power curve, or how I'm growing, is just monumentally slow. Even by the fact that I'm spending time grinding enemies to get all the set pieces, I'm not seeing that same sense of growth that I do in a Souls game when I get a new weapon. Or I take the time and level up my stamina so I can attack more, or my health so I have a bigger buffer. And especially in a game like Neo, where every piece of gear I craft, I can soul match it, I can, tweak it to make it more along my personal preferences rather than just using the same generic sword or kusurigama or anything like that. And I think with that we'll begin to wrap things up. Now, before we do though, one point I'm sure some of you are about to mention is I didn't talk about bosses. And while bosses are a very big part of the Soulsborne formula, it's not a required element, I think, in my opinion. They're still great, but you need to get those 3 points done. The combat system, the level design, and the progression, or nothing else really matters. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, but difficulty is not the main reason why people love the Souls series. Making your game intentionally difficult or frustrating to play doesn't magically make it better. It's about providing a balanced experience, not an overly brutal one. And when it comes to Soulsborne, the skill curve in that game, in the series, is obviously higher compared to other action or other genres. But it's still balanced. And as we've talked about, the beauty of playing a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne is that it should become easier the longer you play, because you're mastering the mechanics and the rules at play. It's not, even though they throw harder enemies or new challenges at you, your mastery of the game should carry you through it. And it's actually very easy to make a hard game. Again, you can look at something like The Surge with over-the-top enemy damage, being able to attack you immediately through combos, and just the general design of how you fight those enemies. But that doesn't magically, or as I said, doesn't automatically make it better. Now, for my final point, if we're going to go forward with this Souls-like subgenre, when I think about games like this, I think of it as a difference between like a normal family car versus a supercar. Yes, they both have the same purpose and the same functionality, but one is at a much higher class and a lot more work has been put into it. And like I said at the start, trying to make a Souls-like is make it or break it. Because if you don't do it right, your whole game is going to suffer in the process. It's one of the things I've been saying where I've played games that are great as, they're as the action genre, as a great game design, but they don't capitalize or they don't work in terms of providing the Souls-like experience. So with that said, one final question for you folks. Besides, of course, the major examples that we've talked about, Dark Souls, The Surge, Bloodborne, even something like Soul and Sanctuary and Neo, can you think of other games that have come out recently that have fit under the Souls-like subgenre or the Souls-like moniker? And are there any points that you feel also represent a Souls-like that we didn't talk about? Either way, be sure to leave a comment below, and thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you have an idea for a future topic, please let me know below. And check back daily for more discussions on design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. So until next time, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends, it always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.